Welcome everyone, broadcasting live from Footscray City College. You're listening to Footscray Live. My name is Marley Hawke, and with me today I have Arav, Stanley, James and Griff. This is the writing show, and our special guest today is writer Maxine Beneba Clarke. Hi Maxine, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me on today.
So Maxine, what kind of books do you write?
So I write a variety of different books. I write children's picture books, I've written short fiction, I've written a memoir, and my most recent book is a book of biographical portraits, kind of profiles of interesting people.
So, Maxine, James here. I was wondering, obviously the book industry, there's a lot of competition and it can be very hard to get into. How did you kickstart your career?
Oh, that's a great question. I did a writing degree out of school, a creative writing degree, and then I actually started in something called slam poetry, which is kind of poetry performed at the microphone. And that was a way for me of getting my work out, of getting a room full of people to actually hear my work. And then gradually editors started hearing me around the place and asking me to contribute single poems to things, and it kind of grew from there.
So, Stanley here. Do you write for a living or do you have another job?
I do write for a living, but I do lots of different kinds of writing for a living. So at the moment, my day job, I guess you'll call it, is I actually work as a poet for a national paper called the Saturday Paper. It comes out once a month on a Saturday, as you'd imagine by the title. And so each week I write a poem on something to do with Australian politics or international politics or something that's going on in the world. And that's kind of my day job. And then I have the kind of book writing that I do.
Yeah.
So it's Arav here. Previously, I know that you've been coming to a program called Story Camp. So what's that about?
So Story Camp is something that I worked for the State Library for, and it was a program where kids from different schools around Victoria could come and do 3 days of workshops at the State Library of Victoria. And these workshops included different things. It could be non-fiction writing, it could be fiction writing, it could be picture books. So I ran a zine writing or zine making workshop for the last Story Camp at the State Library. So kids could come, learn how to make a zine, which is a kind of a little booklet. Zine is short for magazine, I guess, that's made out of an A3 piece of paper, and write their own stories.
So in zines, do you do zines? Do you make them and do you actually put them in bookshops?
No, I used to make them, I suppose, when I was younger, before my books were published. Zines are kind of a way, I guess, of getting information out in book form really quickly in a way that doesn't need to go through a publishing process in terms of someone editing it, agreeing to publish it, sending the work to a printing press. You just do it on an A3 piece of paper and get it out quite quickly. So these days I don't make them really for my own pleasure, but I think it's a great way of teaching young writers how to self-publish their work.
So when it comes to writing stories and stuff like that, do you ever sort of have a time where you sort of experience writer's block, or how do you usually get out of not having any ideas or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think writer's block is a constant battle for all writers. My usual method is to just decide to write anything. So to think, I'm feeling a little bit blocked. Maybe I can just write down what this character looks like, or maybe I can just write down some words about this particular place, even the colours of leaves on a tree. And so I guess my method is anything on the page is better than nothing on the page. So just kind of ideas, and that usually unblocks me.
Maxine, have you had any previous careers?
Yes, I have actually. So before I was a writer, when I went to university, I actually studied creative writing and law, mostly because my parents knew it would be very difficult to make a living as a writer. And so for the first really working years of my life, I worked 3 or 4 days a week in the law field while I kind of supported my writing and made a career for myself.
So how did you exactly switch over from studying law and actually progress your career as a writer?
Well, I was, I guess, working during the day and going out to do these poetry competitions or spoken word nights on the weekends or after work. And gradually, working in the evenings to send off poems here and there. So there was a while where I was doing both, kind of working that day job and also writing as well. And then about probably 6 years ago, I had my first book of fiction published. Before that, I'd only had poetry books published, and that really kicked off things, yeah.
So you've been in this industry for a little while now. Is this your dream job, and do you think you'd ever change out of it?
I think it is my dream job. I mean, I never imagined that I would be able to make a living writing, particularly poetry, or make most of my living writing poetry. There's always more that you can do. You always think, oh, what if this book was made into a film, or things like that. But yeah, I think it is. Writing is my dream job.
So what would you say is like the what would you say is the if you were to give any advice for people that were aspiring writers, what would you give them? As in, like, if they were having trouble writing, what would you say to them that would give them, like, sort of a way to keep going? Yeah.
I think that's a great question. Thank you. I think write about what you love. So you often find that if you're having trouble or you're having doubts or whatever, what do you love writing about? Whether it's sport, whether it's stories, love stories, whether it's about reading, just finding that thing that really you're passionate about, so that is the driver for your work. And read a lot. I think it's really important. If you want to write, you have to read a lot as well.
Now that you've mentioned that you help other people, did someone have to help you when you started off writing, or did you just get it from yourself?
Oh yes, there were so many people who helped me as a writer, right from English teachers at primary school and high school through to even people who would come to hear my poetry at spoken word and give me feedback, let me know what they liked and didn't like, family members. And then as a published writer, there's a whole team of people that support you. So you have your publisher who coordinates the process, you have your editor, all those people.
So what would you say is the hardest part of your job?
I think keeping the ideas coming and keeping the momentum, and I write mostly from home, so there's no boss standing behind me saying, you have to get this done. So just that self-drive, I think.
By now, how many books do you reckon you've written?
I've written 9 books in total, and they're a mixture of poetry, non-fiction and fiction.
Just for anyone who's tuning in, you're listening to The Writing Show on Footscray Live, and our special guest is writer Maxine Beneba Clarke.
So, when you started out, did you have any troubles first getting your work into the public, and what advice would you give to get that out there?
Yeah. So the first couple of books were poetry books, and they were published through a very small publisher and only put in a few bookstores. And then I wrote a book of short fiction, and I won something called the Unpublished Manuscript Award. The book was called Foreign Soil, and that for me really catapulted my career. So I would say enter competitions. Don't be afraid to put your hand up and say, this is what I want to do. That book, Foreign Soil, that won that award, you guys may one day study. It's now on the VC syllabus for Year 12 English. And yeah, that was kind of momentous for me.
What exactly what's your favorite book that you've written, and what's it about?
My favourite book probably is Foreign Soil. It's the only book of fiction I've written. It's a book of short stories. They're set all over the world, and they're about all different characters. A young black teenager in London that's caught up in the middle of a riot, an asylum seeker in Villawood Detention Centre. Some of the stories are actually set in Footscray, so there's a story set up on Berkeley Street in Footscray and one set near Footscray Station. And so that was lovely to actually be able to write our local area into fiction. So I think that book is probably closest to my heart.
What was something you wish you'd have known when you started off writing?
I think how long writing takes, that it takes a really long time to actually get good at writing, and not to worry if things don't happen straight away or if I'm not happy with first drafts, just to keep chipping away at things. And to trust the editing process as well, I think.
Are you working on any books right now?
Great question. I have a book that's coming. I've had a book that's just come out about 3 weeks ago, actually, called The Saturday Portraits. And it's a book of portraits I did of interesting people, including people like Hugh Jackman, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, actor Alex Dimitriadis, Barack Obama, like just a series of interesting books, interesting portraits. So the next book is a kid's book called Meet Taj at the Lighthouse, and it's more for middle grade, so grade 3 and 4 kids.
So, you're a big part of the book industry. What would you say is your favorite author or book?
It's hard. It's a hard question to answer, especially because so many of my friends are authors. Australian authors, I really like a poet and short fiction writer named Ellen van Neerven. She's a First Nations and Aboriginal writer. Melissa Lukashenko is another Australian author that I like. Internationally, I like Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, lots of authors.
So, do you have any books in particular that you like by these authors or you are reading right now?
So I think Melissa Lukashenko, my favourite book of hers is called Too Much Lip. It's a book that last year won the Miles Franklin Award. Actually, it was this year won the Miles Franklin Award. And so it's kind of gotten a lot of acclaim. And Ellen van Neerven, I think my favourite book of hers is a poetry book called Comfort Food.
So, how many awards have you won for your writing?
I've won quite a few. So Foreign Soil, I think, won about 4 awards, which is very unexpected because it was really hard to get published. And my memoir, which is called The Hate Race, it's a memoir about really growing up in Australia in the 80s and 90s, won, I think it was the New South Wales Premier's Award for multicultural writing.
So, what was the hard part about getting your previous book published?
I think because it was short stories for adults, and that's considered in the book industry to be something that doesn't sell very well. They think that a lot of adults aren't interested in writing short fiction. I think because a lot of my characters were culturally diverse characters, most of them were Black African diaspora characters. And so, there was this thought that maybe Australian readers wouldn't be particularly interested in this book. But I think, it's the best selling of all of my works. So it's kind of strange now that it was the most difficult to get published.
Yeah.
So, sorry. Okay, so you have written multiple genres of books, ranging from adult short stories to children's books. What would you say is your favorite genre?
Poetry is definitely my favorite genre of writing, but then each of my kids' books, so my 3 kids' books are called The Patchwork Bike, Wide Big World and Fashionista, and they're kids' picture books, so really for under 7s, and they are actually poems. So I've kind of written poems and then made them into a picture book. So I think that's the natural way I tend to write is poetry, and everything else for me is a little bit more harder work. Yeah.
So, I've noticed that you're focusing on poetry a lot. Are all your books consisting of some kind of poetry form?
I think most of them. Even with the memoir that I wrote, there are kind of lines peppered through it that I would consider to be poetry. And even with the profiles that I wrote of interesting people, the way I tried to write them really used poetic language. I think that fascinates me as a writer, the order of words and how to make them sound beautiful.
Do you often come into writing a new story or book with the mindset of improving on your other works that you've done before that, or do you just write whatever you feel like writing?
Yeah, I do think every writer, when you sit down to write a new work, you want it to be better than your last. And particularly when you have a waiting readership, that, people start to read your books and wait for the next book. But I'm not necessarily thinking about that as I'm writing, but I just hope that because I'm now more experienced, my work does get better.
What is the hardest part about your job?
I think other than the ideas and finding things to write, I think it's very difficult to sell books. You know, we live in a world that's increasingly digital and we're distracted by so many things, movies, social media, time with family. So it is very difficult financially to actually make a living and sell books. So that in addition to kind of generating ideas.
So when you start writing a new book, do you immediately just pick up the pen and paper and start writing, or is there like a format that you follow in your head?
Great question. So I tend to not start working on a book until I've been thinking about it for a very long time. So I think I've had this idea and it would just be running through my head. A couple times a day I'll be thinking about, I could do this or I could have this character. And then it goes to just jotting down some ideas. So this is what I think is going to happen. Often I'll have an opening, but I won't quite know what's going to happen in the middle and the end. And I do work with pen and paper in the first instance. So just jotting down those ideas and things.
Yeah.
And then moving to the laptop and opening the Microsoft Word document and just going. And sometimes I'll start in the middle. So I'll just think, I know I want this scene right in the middle of the book. But it doesn't matter to me where I start as long as I do.
And that brings our show to an end. Thank you for joining us, Maxine. That was writer and poet Maxine Beneba Clarke. My name is Marley Hawke, and I'd like to thank my panel, Arv, Stanley, James, and Griff. This has been The Writing Show on Footscray Live.
Thanks.